Yes, so the strapline of the book is, I have a handy copy here, as you can see, a practical guide to implementing school improvement. And that's really what it is. It's a practical guide and it's a program. So Making Change Stick is a program that I've been developing over the last 10 years or so. And there were two phases to that, really. First of all, I trawled the change management literature and read lots and lots about implementation science, improvement science, ideas from healthcare, from politics, from psychology and so on, and then compiled those into this program, which I've really trialed in lots and lots of schools all over the world over really quite intensively for the last 5 or 6 years or so. And so it's a book which is packed full of practical strategies, and it's kind of a linear program that you work your way through as you're trying to improve outcomes for kids in your school. Yes, absolutely, and that's the really the key thing is that so implementation science was my introduction to this world, and that's really about trying to figure out how to scale up effective practices in real world context, and the real world context is very much the critical part of that equation, because it's all well and good to have a nice flow diagram and a lovely plan, and then you hit reality and that plan goes out of the window, and how do you respond to that? And so this book is very sort of agile, and you have to be sort of quite light on your feet and review the data as it comes in. It's not just about sort of ploughing on regardless with a plan. It's very much like about interacting with reality. Yes, so this is a question that I've started to ask teachers and school leaders over the many years that I've been working with them on this project. And it's a very simple question in some sense. And the question is, what proportion of school improvement initiatives actually improve outcomes for kids? And it's quite an interesting question to ask. You often get quite a mixed response, but actually the responses tend to fall within a fairly narrow bandwidth. Most people come back and say it's about 10 to 20% of school improvement initiatives actually improve things. And if you really push them and you say, I'm talking about improvement initiatives for which you have demonstrable evidence of improvement, that were sustained over several years and are still happening now, often people at that point revise their figure either down to 0, or maybe they point to 1 or 2 things that they think are successful, but it's really a huge minority. And the reason that question blows my mind so much is that A, the figure is so low, B, everybody knows it. When you ask this question, everybody sort of seems to know that that's the case. And C, that doesn't seem to stop people from rolling out the next thing and the next thing and the next and the next, without really seeming to pause and to think, why are so few of these things actually achieving their stated goals? So that's a huge question. And I think the first thing to recognize is that it's hard, like implementing change, even just in your own life. If you try to read more novels or change your diet or go to the gym, say, yesterday was so-called Blue Monday, right? And it's also the day on which most people give up on their New Year's resolutions. January the 19th, January the 20th, Strava, the exercise app, did this analysis of like 800 million data points, and they're like, almost everybody just gives up on their resolution within 3 weeks of the new year. And that's the case for individuals. And so if you think about the scale of the problem when you're trying to change practice on something as large and complex as a school, you can see the scale of the challenge. So that's one reason, I think, is that it's just hard to do. It's hard to pull off. But there are 2 reasons that I think are not really spoken about enough, and these are the 2 reasons that I really focus on in the book. One is that teachers and school leaders simply aren't taught how to implement change effectively. And I know that partly because it used to be my job to deliver the NPQs, the National Professional Qualifications that aspiring school leaders take. And in the old NPQ system, there was very little focus on change management. In the new NPQ system, some new frameworks came out a few years ago. There is more of an explicit focus on implementation. But the people who wrote those frameworks essentially took the EEF's guidance, their implementation framework, this 4-stage cycle, and they just sort of bolted it onto the end of each of the NPQ frameworks. And there's some good stuff in the EEF guidance, but it's quite a high level document, and it doesn't really contain the detailed, understandings, the detailed tools and strategies for how to implement change. So that's number one. Teachers and school leaders aren't taught how to do this stuff, and that's rather an oversight because implementing change is basically your job if you're a school leader. And then the second reason, which is absolutely huge, is that we almost always default to top-down change, not just in schools, but in hospitals, in businesses, in government. We have a pyramidal structure, don't we? Almost always, where there's a small number of people at the top of the organization who sort of make decisions on everybody else's behalf. And that can be useful in some circumstances when swift action is called for. Top-down is great. But when we're talking about the kinds of problems that we're trying to fix here, things like closing the disadvantage gap, improving literacy and numeracy rates, improving mental health and well-being, improving teacher retention, if you think more widely about the fact that life expectancy is going down for the first time in decades, cost of living crisis, climate change, these big sort of so-called wicked problems, these very, very difficult problems, very clearly the small number of people at the top of these organizations have not got the answers to those questions. And so we need to figure out a way of implementing change in such a way that overcomes the problems of top-down change, and there are many of them, and that's what this program does. Yeah, not just at a lower level, but getting buy-in at all levels of the organization. So we use this idea called a slice team, which is an idea that I took from the implementation science literature, where you take a cross-section through the organization. And so instead of just having senior leaders making all the decisions behind closed doors, which is what usually happens, you have a slice team where you have a representation from the senior team, yes, but also middle leaders, early career teachers, the Senko, sometimes kids, parents, governors, site staff, whoever it is, all of the people who have a relative, I beg your pardon, who have a relevant perspective on the change that you're trying to implement. And you get those people sitting around the decision-making table together, not just as a consultation exercise, but actually as the executive. Like they're essentially tasked with overseeing this change initiative from beginning to end, often over a period of several months or even years. Yes, that's a nice way of putting it. Yes, they flatten the hierarchy, and there's a few things that we can do to achieve that. One is that we make that explicit, so we have some explicit ground rules where we say around this table, although there is an implicit hierarchy, although there are teaching assistants and senior leaders and middle leaders and so on sitting around this table, as far as possible everybody's an equal, everybody's equally responsible for contributing to writing this plan and also for executing that plan over time. There are other things that we can do where we gel the team, so we find ways to get the team to really get to know one another and to become coherent as a team, agreeing shared group goals and so on. And there's a lovely activity, a very powerful activity that comes early on in the program called 5-minute interviews, where let's say you've decided on a feedback initiative that your school is going to try to improve feedback. And so you come up with a group of questions about that. What do you think about this feedback initiative? Do you agree that this is a priority for the school at this point in time? What questions do you have? What ideas do you have? What concerns do you have? And then each member of the slice team goes away and talks to other people like them, and they ask them those questions. So the teaching assistant goes and asks a representative sample of other TAs, middle leaders speak to other middle leaders and so on. And then they bring that information back to the slice team the next time we meet. And they can also roll in their own views with this anonymized feedback that they provide. So they don't say, oh, Bob thinks this is a rubbish idea. They sort of say, oh, people are concerned about this, or people actually think that this isn't really a priority at this point in time, that behavior is really difficult, and that's their number one priority. We need to improve our systems around that before we think about feedback. And so you really get a very strong sense of what people really think, and it provides this nice safe mechanism for people to feel free to air their honest views without fear of repercussion. And just as a final point on this, the schools that I've worked with almost always say the first time that they work in this way, we're never going to not do this now because it's so effective. You just really get a sense of what people are thinking. And two things happen when you work with a slice team in this way. One is that you can see out into the world, and you can really get a sense of what people are thinking, and you get much better decision making for that reason, because you've thought about how this plays out for all of these different types of people. But most importantly, people can see in. It's a very transparent process, and so to go back to your question, you really get buy-in. People come with you on this journey. They can see that they are represented on this change team, that there's somebody with whom they can interact throughout the change period, and so you harness and unleash all of this sort of untold latent potential of people to be willing to implement these ideas at the point of need and to take ownership over this, and so they come with you on the journey rather than feeling like they're being done to. Well, the early signs are really promising. As I say, this has been tried and tested in many schools, and the feedback and the impact so far, it's already having an impact. This program is that's already happening. But if you think back to the mind-blowing question, what proportion of school improvement initiatives fail to improve outcomes? Usually, let's say that we take 20% as the upper limit of where we think that figure is. That means that 80% of school improvement initiatives are not actually improving anything. And if you think about the scale of that problem, if you think about how many schools there are, there's 30,000 schools in this country, there's about 5 million schools worldwide, and most of those schools are implementing 2 or 3 fairly large school improvement initiatives at any one time. And if you do the maths, that scales up to literally billions of hours that schools are spending every year implementing school improvement initiatives that don't actually improve anything. And if every school leader and teacher could be trained and well versed in these very practical, tried and tested tools that will improve that success rate, the scale of the impact that could have on improving outcomes for kids, whether it's literacy and numeracy, or attendance, or mental health and well-being, or teacher retention, or improving parent relations, whatever it is that schools are trying to do, if we could get that figure up to 50%, or even just 30%, the scale of the impact that could have on kids' lives around the world is absolutely phenomenal. So I'm very hopeful and optimistic that this book and these ideas and the program that goes along with it will have a huge impact on people learning outcomes and life outcomes beyond that around the world. But that remains to be seen. Let's see how this plays out. Yes, absolutely, and not just to any kind of school, but more widely than this. Like these ideas, especially the idea of slice teams making decisions instead of defaulting to top-down change, that should be happening, I think, far more widely. I did a TEDx talk a couple of years ago, essentially saying we should have slice politics. Instead of having one politician at the top of the health service, for example, who usually has never worked in the health service, if instead you had a slice team running the NHS with representation from different types of clinicians, patient groups, people living in social care, the junior doctors and nurses and so on, we would have those same benefits. You get much better decision making, you'd have much more buy-in, and so I think that these ideas have got legs far beyond education. But yes, certainly within education they can be applied to any improvement initiative in any kind of organisation. Indeed, the all-important question. So the book is available in all good booksellers, as you might expect. If you just Google it, you'll find it. You'll be able to get it from the Hachette online store. And also, I have a Substack newsletter, which goes out once a fortnight, makingchangestick.substack.com, I believe is the URL, or if you just search Making Change Stick within the Substack app, then you'll find me there. And that's nice because I can release excerpts from the book and share impacts and case studies and so on. And we can have an ongoing conversation in that space. So you can find me there.